And instead of using those revenues, the army took out huge loans from French banks and then asked the finance ministry, the civilian finance ministry, to secure those loans.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Today, Palestine, Omar Barghouti and the Gandhi Peace Award, Syria, the gas attacks, the April 29th climate mobilization in D.C., Egypt and Sisi and Trump, and closing with a 70-year-old controversy about Germany. We start with the unusual, in that it was caught on video. An Israeli soldier beating a Palestinian.
מה אתם באים? בלי ידיים! בלי ידיים! בלי ידיים! בלי ידיים! אל תגידו לי ידיים! התפשרות!
And here are Israeli enthusiasts in the so-called Jewish Defense League beating a Palestinian who had taken part in a protest outside of the D.C. meeting of AIPAC. Other than that nasty beating, something very positive happened in D.C. that day. Something like 1,000 people, led by a Jewish group called If Not Now, blocked entrances to the loathsome AIPAC assembly. This was not the far left, but Jews who had become politically alive in the protests of the last Gaza massacre. They hashtag Jewish resistance. As we record, we still don't know if Omar Barghouti will be allowed to travel to the U.S. to receive the Gandhi Peace Award. Over 700 have petitioned the Israeli government to let him go. He is to be introduced by Rebecca Volkommersem of Jewish Voice for Peace. That group last weekend gave a resounding round of applause and solidarity with Omar Barghouti.
Omar Barghouti, who is a leader in the BDS movement, has been enduring what is so far a 12-day-long interrogation at the hands of the Israeli security system. He wrote recently in a note to supporters, though, something I think really important and really typical of his perspective on the world and on social change, which is that nothing empowers human rights defenders facing political persecution like the warm feeling that there is a whole community of activists and people of conscience standing with them and carrying on the struggle no matter what. And we are going to send Omar a message.
Omar Barghouti, we stand with you, and we will carry on the work no matter what.
And with all the justified attention to Barghouti, let's not forget Ralph Nader. I was told recently that young people don't really know him. When they hear his name, they think about his presidential runs. Astounding. Many people are alive today because of his breakthrough on car safety and other consumer issues. So I wrote a piece about it. It's called Ralph Nader for People Under 30. You can read it at peacenews.org. And please, if you're around Connecticut on Sunday, April 23rd, come to the Gandhi Peace Award. Meet Ralph Nader and, hopefully, Omar Barghouti. I won't display the most horrific photos of Assad's latest chemical attack, just some of the saddest. Here is one, a little girl being carried carefully and respectfully to her grave. In the far distance awaits her mother. These photos sent by Kanan Rahmani. He writes, "This is Abdulhamid Al-Yusuf from Khan Sheikhoun. He lost 20 members of his family during the Assad regime's sarin gas attack yesterday, including his twin infants. Here he is holding them for the last time." These were the two in life. There's a pathetic strain of leftists I call anti-imperialists who hate showing these pictures. They claim it will only strengthen the war hawks and neocons who want war with Assad. And that's the end of the argument. They have nothing to propose. No solidarity is suggested with our Syrian brothers and sisters, except perhaps calling for the U.S. to allow in some refugees. We suggest, as we have for years, that there are other things that can be and should be demanded, like airdrops of food and supplies to break every siege, publication of the data the U.S. has on Syrian and Russian flights so that individual airmen can eventually be put on trial for war crimes, double U.S. money sent to the White Helmets, sanction actual Syrian, Iranian, and Russians involved in war crimes, publicize the efforts of Syrian civil society groups trying to survive assaults by Assad, foreigners, and fundamentalists. And by the way, the Russians should supply their own flight data on Western planes committing war crimes. Remember, under Trump, hundreds of civilians have been wantonly killed by the bombings in Iraq and Syria. These are the results of a different regime bombing. 30 civilians killed, not gassed in Idlib, but blown up in Ghouta, where 1,300 were gassed in 2013. On April 29th, the giant climate mobilization in Washington, D.C. A couple of days later is Mayday. There are major calls for strikes in a number of cities, strikes by store owners, students, and workers. One such city is New Haven. They're holding an event on the New Haven Green called General Strike, Solidarity, and Resistance. It will start on noon on May 1st, go on till 5 p.m., followed by a big march in the streets. Trump brought the Egyptian dictator to the Oval Office and praised him to the hilt. Al-Sisi holds the record this century for peaceful protesters shot to death in one day. He holds tens of thousands in prison. Trump admires him, but not all is well for the regime in Egypt, as Democracy Now! Sharif Abdel Kouddous explains.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump meeting with Egyptian President General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi at the White House today, even as Sisi faces widespread criticism for human rights abuses in Egypt. Human rights organizations say Sisi and his security forces have arrested tens of thousands of Egyptians and have committed torture, forced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. The Trump administration has indicated it will not bring up the human rights abuses during today's meeting. As we return to Cairo to speak with Democracy Now! Correspondent, Nation fellow Sharif Abdel Kouddous. Sharif, in part two of this conversation, if you can talk about the response in Egypt to Sisi coming to the United States, and what would make a difference in Egypt to be raised here in the United States while the Egyptian president is here?
Well, if you follow the pro-state media in Egypt, they have very loudly celebrated Sisi's relationship with Trump. The fact that Sisi is the first Arab leader to be received at the White House, the fact that that Sisi is the first person to call Trump. They've also exaggerated these wild claims that Trump won because Sisi endorsed him and things of this nature. But, you know, it's hard to get a sense of the national mood from the pro-state media. They represent a very narrow portion of the state and the political and economic elite. You know, there's widespread dissatisfaction with Sisi, not just because of human rights abuses, but because the economy is really on the brink of collapse. There is skyrocketing inflation. Prices are going through the roof. There's massive debt that this government has taken on. There's austerity measures, including subsidy cuts and tax increases that have been put in place to secure a very stringent $12 billion IMF loan. There's also a $3 billion World Bank loan. There's been shortages of sugar and baby formula. And all of this comes as the military has injected itself more directly into the economy. It's expanded its domination of many economic sectors in the country. And you have to understand, in Egypt, military generals manage these monopolistic enterprises, which are conglomerates that are untaxed and unaudited and have multiple interests, including construction and pharmaceutical plants, land sales, cement and steel factories. They receive massive no-bid contracts from the government. And they don't use these revenues to pay for massive and lavish arms procurements. We've signed almost $2 billion worth of arms deals with France. And instead of using those revenues, the army took out huge loans from French banks and then asked the finance ministry, the civilian finance ministry, to secure those loans. So this is spiraling the economy into a very difficult situation. And so I think most Egyptians, Sisi has lost a lot of popularity because of these policies that are disproportionately affecting the majority poor. Again, it's hard to speak for most people, but I think, you know, people would like some kind of acknowledgement of the complete crackdown on any and all dissent here in Egypt, the freeing of so many prisoners. You know, when we say tens of thousands of prisoners, each one of these people is a story. You heard the story earlier about Aya Hagazi. It's almost difficult to describe what it was like to see her in the defendant's cage. But there's so many like her. There's journalists, like Shawkan, who's been in prison since August 2013. There's journalists who've been sentenced to life in prison. There's Ala Abdel Fattah and icons of the revolution who are still behind bars. And all of this happens with the complete consent of the United States in terms of its continued military backing, its continued support of the Egyptian government. Again, there is, the Trump administration has talked of rebooting the relationship with Egypt. We'll have to see whether this is more of a glorified photo op. There is a difference in rhetoric. Trump does want to restart something called the Bright Star, which is a biennial massive military exercise that took place with Egypt and other countries. But the core of the relationship hasn't changed in decades, whether it was under Mubarak, under the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, under Morsi, or now under Sisi. And that is continued diplomatic, military, and economic support for the country, and very little criticism of human rights abuses.
Sharif, you wrote about how human rights groups are targeted and have been targeted by a large and sophisticated phishing campaign referring to Nile fish. Explain what you're talking about.
Well, phishing is a form of hacking. It happened in the United States with the Podesta emails, where you receive an email in your inbox that purports to be from, say Google or Adobe or something like that, and you're requested to put in your credentials, your email address and your password, in order to see the file. But in fact, the operator of the phishing attack gets your password and then hacks your account. And the leading human rights groups in Egypt, almost all of them are, in fact, all of them are part of this massive criminal prosecution that has been going on for years, were hit with a very sophisticated phishing attack late last year and continued into early this year, where emails would come in that were, timed after, for example, one woman, a prominent human rights defender, Azza Suleiman, was arrested, and just moments later, a lot of these human rights advocates, her friends, got emails purporting to be the police arrest file, something that most people would want right after she was arrested. And so this was the kind of sophisticated attack that it's done. The human rights group in Egypt that documented these attacks says this was a government attack. They don't have absolute proof, but they say the level of sophistication, the timing of it, and also given the government's history of probing further into the internet and using different kinds of targeting and different kinds of technology, that this was a government attack. And I must say, this is part of a much larger and much more repressive campaign against all civil society in Egypt, particularly ones that document human rights, that document economic abuse. And so we've seen at least 20 of the most prominent human rights defenders. Many have been on Democracy Now!, like Hossein Bahgat and Aida Saif al-Dawla and Gamal Eid and others. They have been subject to travel bans. They're not allowed to leave the country. They've had their assets frozen. And they're facing criminal prosecution in this glacial trial that's taking place, where they're accused of foreign funding to destabilize the country. And Sisi changed in a decree a couple of years ago that statutes in the penal code where foreign funding to destabilize the country or harm national security, or these very vague terms, carries a life sentence. And so for many of us who know these people well, who respect very much their work, the important work that they do, we can only watch as this trial goes forward.
Sharif, we just have 40 seconds. How did Sisi rise to power?
Sisi came from military intelligence. He was the youngest person on the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces when the revolution took place. And he was appointed by Mohamed Morsi, the elected president, to become the new defense minister, replacing Tantawi, who was a long-time defense minister under Mubarak. And then in 2013, he himself ousted Mohamed Morsi, and he said he wouldn't run for president. And a year later, he did, won by an astonishing 98%, well, because there was really no opposition against him.
I want to thank Sharif Abdel Kouddous for joining us, Democracy Now!'s correspondent and Cairo Nation Institute fellow. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report.
Finally, the authorities in the idiot British Labour Party voted to continue its suspension of Ken Livingstone for 12 more months because of an off-the-cuff statement he made describing what Adolf Hitler did in the early 1930s. Livingstone is the former mayor of London, and in defending another Labour Party member last year, had mentioned Hitler's collaboration with Zionist groups when Hitler first came to power. This drove British Zionists into a frenzy, and the very weak head of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, wouldn't stand up for the truth and put Livingstone through public and private inquisitions. So we will conclude by repeating a bit of my interview with historian Lenni Brenner about what really happened between the Zionists and the Nazis in the early 1930s.
The facts aren't in disagreement. It's the interpretation of the facts and the intention of what they were doing. You know, today the Zionists say, "Hey, the Zionists were trying to save what they could out of the Germany, etc." But that's not really true. For example, in that time period, 1933 to 1939, which is when the war broke out, only 22% of the Zionist immigrants into Palestine came from Germany. In other words, the Zionist attitude is, hey, we got guys all over the world. You know, they want to come here. So, you know, we want to get their support, so we can't just take Germans. But then in addition to that, it's very important to understand, when it came to Germans, they only wanted certain German Jews and not others. Number one, they didn't want old people because they come there and die, and who needs that, you know? Okay. Number two, they wanted Zionists and people who could speak a little Hebrew, or people who had some money, or people who had trade skills that would be useful to the Zionists in Germany. So if you were, let's say, a German kosher butcher in Berlin, they did, 60-year-old German kosher butcher in Berlin, they wouldn't even give you an instant of their time, you know.
So it's more about building up Palestine than saving.
Exactly. Okay. I mean, their whole mentality was, hey, Hitler proves us right. I mean, us Jews can't live in other countries in peace. Now let's, do a deal and build up Palestine.
All right. I want to jump to your book again, the newest version. Could you hold it up with the cover?
Okay. Now, this cover is a Nazi, on the cover, Zionism, the Age of Dictators, and there's this, the two faces of a medal. Let me go into that because this goes directly into the topic. The Zionists, the Nazis decided, okay, we'll work with the Zionists. So the Zionists convinced Baron von Mildenstein, who was the Nazi head of the SS's, what they call Jewish department. In other words, the part of the SS that specialized in dealing with Jews, And
if I may, if we recall, SS were the worst of the worst. Later on, yes, were in charge of the extermination. All right, go back to now to 1933.
Good. Okay, and a Zionist convinced von Mildenstein to write an article on the Zionists in Palestine. But von Mildenstein said, "Look, before I write the article, I want to go to Palestine and observe what's going on there." So von Mildenstein, the SS man, was a guest of the World Zionist Organization in Palestine for 6 months. And then he came back and wrote 12 articles for Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister, for der Angriff, which means the attack or the assault. about his trip to Palestine. And Goebbels, to commemorate the trip, produced a medal. And this, I have the medal here.
You got it a couple of years ago, I understand.
What happened was some guy, a guy who read my book, found it in one of these Nazi memorabilia stores, right? And the store didn't understand its importance, but since the guy had read my book, he recognized it immediately and grabbed it and gave it to me, etc.
All right, if you could hold it up.
All right, let me hold it up. Okay, and what it says now. The main thing about it is that on one side there's a Star of David, that's the Zionist symbol, and then on the other side is a swastika. And it says in German, of course, I'll read it in German and then translate it. A Nazi fahrt nach Palästina. Okay. A Nazi goes to Palestine and writes about it in the Angriff, okay, which is Goebbels' paper. So there's no doubt that it happened. I mean, here's the medal. And what von Mildenstein said, and this was, again, to show you that the Nazis were patronizing the Zionists. This wasn't just get the out of here, kind of thing. He said, okay, I'm reading from my own book. His stay among the Zionists has shown the SS man, quote, now I'm quoting von Mildenstein, quote, the way to curing a centuries-long wound on the body of the world, the Jewish question. The soil has reformed him and his kind in a decade. This new Jew will be a new people.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.